In a small town, life moved slowly. People went about their routines, and most were content to follow the rules quietly. But not him. He had always been different. From a young age, he noticed things others ignored. He noticed when people were treated unfairly, when voices were silenced, and when truth was hidden. While most preferred to look away, he could not. He wasn't a loud man by nature. He didn't crave attention or recognition. Instead, he had a quiet determination to speak when something felt wrong. His voice was calm but firm, and his words carried weight because they came from honesty, not arrogance. People in the town respected him quietly, even if they were too afraid to say it openly. At first, his actions were small. He wrote letters to local officials, reporting problems in schools, mismanagement in public services, and instances where ordinary people were taken advantage of. He spoke at community meetings, raising questions that others were too afraid to ask. Some thought he was overstepping, but he saw it as a responsibility. He understood that when no one speaks, injustice grows in silence. One day he noticed something that bothered him deeply. A new construction project was underway near the river, but it was clear that the builders were cutting corners. Safety regulations were being ignored, and the riverbank was being damaged. He attended the meetings, asked questions, and documented everything. His findings showed that the project could have serious consequences for the environment and the local people who relied on the river for fishing and daily needs. When he raised these concerns publicly, a few people started to worry. Some town officials quietly advised him to let it go. They said it wasn't his fight, that he should mind his own business. But he refused. For him, staying silent was never an option. He knew that if he ignored the problem, others would suffer, and the damage might never be repaired. Soon, his actions began to attract attention beyond the town hall meetings. Local newspapers mentioned him occasionally, highlighting his concern for the community. People were curious. They asked why he risked so much for issues that did not affect him directly. He would always answer the same way. Because it's right. Someone has to speak. Not everyone appreciated his efforts. Some powerful people in the town started seeing him as a problem. They thought he was stirring unrest, creating unnecessary attention, and challenging their authority. Quiet threats began to reach him. Anonymous notes slipped under his door warned him to stop. Some people approached him with veiled threats, smiling as they implied that his life would be easier if he kept quiet. Despite the pressure, he continued. He met privately with journalists, sharing information and evidence. He reached out to environmental experts to support his claims about the river. Slowly, he started to gather allies, ordinary people who had seen the same problems and were too scared to speak. They joined him quietly, offering support, sharing information, and helping him gather facts. Even his own family worried for him. They pleaded with him to stop, reminding him that powerful people were not easy to confront. They feared for his safety, knowing that sometimes people who challenged authority faced serious consequences. But he listened politely, then went back to his work. To him, fear could not be stronger than responsibility. The turning point came one morning when the construction workers arrived, and he saw a section of the riverbank collapsing. He rushed to take photos and videos. The images were clear evidence that the warnings he had raised were not being taken seriously. He shared them with the media, posting them online and sending them to local newspapers. Within hours, people began to take notice. It wasn't long before the reactions came. Local authorities tried to downplay the situation, calling it an accident, and suggested that he was exaggerating. They even tried to discredit him publicly, accusing him of spreading false information. Some neighbors who had previously been supportive turned away, afraid of being associated with controversy. He felt the isolation, but it didn't stop him. He knew that the truth was stronger than any lie, and evidence could not be ignored forever. Soon, larger media outlets picked up the story. Journalists visited the town to see the damage themselves. Interviews were conducted, videos were recorded, and the story began spreading beyond the small community. Suddenly, a man who had once been quiet and ordinary became the voice of reason and courage for thousands of people. The pressure increased. The local authorities tried even harder to silence him. They offered bribes, hoping he would go away quietly. They tried to intimidate him through legal threats. They even attempted to smear his reputation, suggesting that he was acting out of personal interest. But he remained calm. He did not respond with anger or revenge. He responded with evidence, truth, and persistence. people began to notice a remarkable change in the town. Residents who had been passive started to speak up. Small groups formed to support him and to demand accountability. What had started as one man's effort to expose wrongdoing turned into a collective call for justice. People were inspired by his courage. They saw that if one ordinary person could challenge authority and speak truthfully, they could too. At home, he would sometimes reflect on how ordinary his life had been before this. He had never sought recognition, wealth, or power. He simply wanted to do what was right. Yet his actions were changing lives, not just in his town but across the region. People began sharing his story online, praising his courage and persistence. Messages of support came from strangers who had seen similar injustices in their own communities. Despite the attention and growing movement, he never let it affect his focus. He continued documenting, speaking, and gathering evidence. He remained humble, avoiding the spotlight, and always redirecting attention to the issues rather than himself. His message was simple. The problem matters more than the person speaking. The truth matters more than fear. And courage is not about being fearless. It's about continuing despite fear. One evening, he was invited to speak at a small town gathering. People crowded into a modest hall, eager to hear his words. He spoke slowly, calmly, and clearly. He did not yell or demand attention. Instead, he explained what had been happening, why it mattered, and how people could make a difference. His words resonated because they were real, heartfelt, and grounded in evidence. People listened in silence, realizing the power of one voice to spark awareness and change. By the end of the night, applause filled the room, not for him personally, but for what he had done. Ordinary citizens felt empowered. They realized that change was possible if enough people were willing to act with honesty and courage. Even though he had faced threats, isolation, and attempts to silence him, he had persevered. And the ripple effect was beginning. As he walked home that night, he thought about the journey. He thought about the fear, the pressure, and the challenges. But he also thought about the hope, the support, and the change that had begun. He understood that this was only the start. The fight was far from over, and the people who tried to silence him would not give up easily. But he was ready. He had learned that when the truth is on your side and when you speak from integrity, no amount of threats can truly silence your voice. And so, in the quiet of his home, surrounded by papers, photos, and evidence, he prepared for what was to come. He didn't know how far his voice would reach or how many people would eventually hear it. But he knew this. If one person could inspire courage, awareness, and action, then perhaps the world could be changed one voice at a time. The story of this quiet man, who refused to be silenced, had just begun, and the world, little by little, was starting to listen. After his speech at the town gathering, things began to change rapidly. People started talking, not just quietly among themselves, but openly. Conversations about fairness, truth, and justice began appearing in cafes, shops, and schools. Some people even took small actions, writing letters, signing petitions, or sharing his story on social media. What had once seemed like one man's quiet struggle was turning into a movement. However, not everyone welcomed this change. Those in power who felt threatened by his voice were growing increasingly anxious. They had underestimated him at first, assuming he was just a local man with little influence. But now, as his message spread beyond the town, their fear grew. Meetings were held in secret. Plans were made to try and silence him once and for all. They assumed that if they could pressure him, intimidate him, or isolate him, the movement would collapse. Threats became more direct. A few days after his speech, someone left a note on his doorstep. It was simple, almost polite, yet chilling. "Stop speaking. This is your only warning." He read it carefully, then folded it and placed it in his drawer. Fear flickered in his mind for a brief moment, but it quickly faded. He had faced challenges before, and this was no different. He knew that stopping now would only give them power. Courage, he realized, was not the absence of fear. It was acting despite it. Still, the intensity of the situation began to weigh on him. For the first time, he felt the isolation deeply. People who had once supported him now avoided him, worried they would be targeted. Friends whispered warnings and urged him to reconsider. Even some members of his family were concerned, suggesting he step back and let others handle the situation. But he remained resolute. He had seen too much to turn away. He decided to document everything meticulously. Every threat, Every act of intimidation and every attempt to discredit him was carefully recorded. He knew that one day, this evidence might be necessary to protect himself and to show the truth to the world. He kept notes, photographs, and even recorded videos of interactions where he felt threatened. This preparation became a form of quiet empowerment, giving him a sense of control amid the growing tension. The media started noticing his story more seriously. Journalists came from nearby cities, curious about the man who dared to stand up to powerful people in a small town. Interviews were recorded, footage was captured, and his words began reaching a larger audience. People were inspired by his calm yet unshakable stance. He did not shout or make grandiose claims. He simply presented facts, told stories, and spoke about the consequences of ignoring injustice. The authenticity of his message resonated deeply. With growing attention, the opposition intensified. Local authorities tried to manipulate situations against him. They spread rumors questioning his motives, suggesting that he had personal reasons to challenge the system. They approached his neighbors, hoping to turn them against him. Yet despite the attempts to isolate him, a few steadfast supporters remained. These people quietly offered help, shelter, and guidance. They helped distribute his writings, documented injustices, and ensured that his voice continued to reach those who needed to hear it. One morning, as he walked to the small river near town, he noticed something alarming. Equipment that had been left unattended overnight was being tampered with. It was clear that someone had deliberately tried to hide evidence or destroy proof of wrongdoing. He quickly took photographs and notes, documenting every detail. The stakes were rising, and it was no longer just about being ignored or dismissed. Real attempts were being made to undermine his work. Despite the danger, he refused to back down. Instead, he decided to engage with the people directly affected by the issues. He visited families living near the river, spoke to workers on the construction site, and connected with environmental experts. He gathered testimonies, photographs, and stories. Each person he spoke with reminded him why his voice mattered. People had been suffering quietly for years, and they now felt hope because someone was finally listening. However, the opposition was relentless. One evening, as he returned home, he found that his mailbox had been tampered with. Letters had been removed, and documents he had sent to journalists were delayed. It became clear that the people trying to silence him had more resources than he had imagined. They had been monitoring his actions and attempting to control how information spread. Yet every act of intimidation only strengthened his resolve. He realized that to counter these tactics he needed to be smarter, not louder. He began encrypting communications, using secure methods to share evidence with journalists, and creating backups of every document and photograph. He also started teaching his small circle of supporters how to safely document issues and spread awareness. His calm and strategic approach made it difficult for his opponents to block the message entirely. Meanwhile, the public response was growing. Social media played a huge role in amplifying his voice. People from different towns, cities, and even countries started noticing his efforts. They shared his posts, commented on his videos, and offered advice. Some provided support in the form of funding to help him document evidence more effectively. Others volunteered to connect him with legal experts and activists who could guide him in navigating the increasingly dangerous situation. Even though he had more support than ever, he remained humble. He never claimed that the movement was about him. Instead, he highlighted the issues, the people affected, and the importance of standing up for justice. He frequently reminded his supporters that courage was contagious, and that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences if they chose to act. His message was clear. The focus was not on fame, but on truth and responsibility. The threats, however, escalated. Anonymous calls in the middle of the night, strange cars near his home, and suspicious strangers observing his movements became part of daily life. Some of his allies suggested that he leave town temporarily for his safety. Yet leaving was not an option. If he left, the message would lose momentum, and those responsible for wrongdoing might continue unchecked. He understood the risks, but he also understood the greater cost of silence. He began holding small, discreet meetings in safe locations to coordinate with supporters and journalists. They shared strategies for spreading information, protecting sources, and countering false narratives. Every meeting was a careful balance between urgency and caution. He had to ensure that while the message reached the world, those helping him remained safe. The level of dedication from these individuals impressed him deeply. Despite fear, they chose to act because they believed in truth. One afternoon, a journalist asked him why he continued despite all the danger. He paused, thinking carefully, then said, "Because if we stay silent, nothing changes. The world will never hear the truth if no one is brave enough to speak." Courage is not the absence of fear. It is moving forward even when fear is real. These words were later quoted widely, inspiring many who had previously felt powerless. As weeks turned into months, his efforts began showing results. Investigative reports confirmed many of the issues he had raised. Authorities, who initially dismissed him, could no longer ignore the mounting evidence. Public pressure increased, fueled by ordinary citizens who had become aware of the truth. People began attending town meetings, asking questions, and demanding accountability. What had started as a solitary effort was now a collective movement. Despite the victories, he remained vigilant. The people who tried to silence him had not given up. He knew that challenges would continue, and perhaps even grow more intense. But by now, he understood a crucial lesson. The power of one person's voice, combined with persistence and integrity, could spark change that no threats could extinguish. Each day he reminded himself that courage was a choice, and that choosing to act could inspire countless others to do the same. Even in moments of exhaustion and fear, he found hope in small victories. A family grateful for his support, a journalist acknowledging his findings, or a stranger writing to say how his words had changed their perspective. These moments reminded him why he could never give up. Change was slow and danger was real, but the world was beginning to listen, and every step forward mattered. By the end of this period, it was clear that the man who had once been quiet and unassuming was now at the center of a growing movement. His voice could not be ignored, his message could not be silenced, and his courage had become contagious. Ordinary people began to realize that standing up for truth, even against formidable opposition, was not only possible but necessary. The stage was now set for what would come next. The world was listening, but the fight was far from over. His voice had reached far beyond the small town, but the forces against him were still active, and the challenges ahead would test his courage in ways he had never imagined. Yet despite all obstacles, he remained steadfast, prepared to continue speaking, documenting, and inspiring those who dared to believe that truth and justice could prevail. By now, his story had started to reach far beyond the small town. Local newspapers, online platforms, and social media channels were sharing his efforts, and people from other cities and even other countries were noticing. Messages of support poured in every day, many from strangers who had faced similar struggles and felt inspired by his courage. Yet with recognition came greater risks. Those who wanted him silenced were no longer content with quiet threats, they were escalating their actions. It started subtly at first. Strange vehicles appeared near his home late at night. People he had never seen before seemed to follow him to his meetings or linger nearby when he was out gathering information. Even his phone calls felt less private. Some calls were disconnected abruptly, and occasionally he would hear strange noises in the background. The reality was clear. His voice had grown powerful enough to be considered dangerous by people who wanted control. Despite this, he refused to change his mission. Instead, he became more cautious and strategic. He arranged meetings in safe locations, avoided predictable routines, and used encrypted methods to share sensitive information with trusted journalists and supporters. He understood that courage was not recklessness. It was careful persistence. His message was too important to risk being stopped by fear. One morning, a message arrived that shocked him. It was from a journalist who had been helping him document evidence. The journalist had been threatened and was being forced to leave town. Suddenly, the danger was no longer abstract. It was personal, affecting people who had chosen to stand with him. He felt a surge of responsibility. If his allies were being targeted, he had to protect them while ensuring that the truth continued to reach the public. He decided to organize a small network of support. He contacted legal advisors, independent investigators, and community leaders who could offer guidance and protection. They helped him plan secure ways to gather evidence and communicate, without exposing anyone to unnecessary risk. The network became a lifeline, ensuring that the story continued to grow despite mounting threats. At the same time, public awareness continued to increase. People who had previously ignored problems began to pay attention. Citizens attended town meetings, asking questions directly and holding authorities accountable. The ripple effect of his persistence was clear. One person's refusal to remain silent had inspired dozens, who in turn inspired hundreds. It was no longer just his fight. It had become a movement driven by ordinary people demanding truth and accountability. With this growing attention came pressure from those in power. They attempted to discredit him publicly, spreading rumors that he had personal motives or was exaggerating claims. They even tried to manipulate journalists by offering false evidence or bribes. The strategy was to make the truth seem unreliable and create doubt in the public mind. Yet, despite their best efforts, his careful documentation and calm, factual communication left little room for manipulation. People could see clearly who was speaking the truth. He also had to deal with the emotional toll. Nights became restless, filled with worry for himself and those around him. He knew that any misstep could have serious consequences. But in quiet moments, he found strength in small victories. A journalist confirming facts, a neighbor voicing support, a family affected by the issues thanking him for noticing their struggles. These moments reminded him why the risk was worth it. Courage, he realized, was fueled by purpose, not just bravery. One day, a large news outlet picked up his story. A team of reporters came to the town, interviewing him and those he had helped. They documented the evidence, filmed the damaged riverbank, and highlighted the impact on local families. The story went viral, reaching millions online. Suddenly, a quiet man from a small town had become a symbol of standing up against injustice. People everywhere were inspired by his calm determination and refusal to be silenced. However, this attention made the opposition more desperate. They attempted to intimidate him in public, confronting him at meetings, trying to provoke an emotional response that could be used against him. They pressured local authorities to take legal action, claiming that his activities were disruptive. But he remained composed. He had learned that reacting with anger or fear would only give them power. Instead, he relied on patience, preparation, and evidence. As the movement grew, ordinary citizens began documenting problems themselves. Inspired by his courage, people submitted photographs, videos, and reports of issues in their own neighborhoods. Communities that had long felt powerless now realized they could have a voice. What had started as a single person speaking out had transformed into a collective effort, amplifying the message far beyond what he could have imagined. Despite progress, danger remained constant. Late one evening, he noticed unusual activity near his home. Figures moved cautiously in the shadows and unfamiliar cars parked nearby. He stayed calm, observing carefully, documenting what he could without confrontation. The reality was clear. Those trying to silence him were watching, waiting for an opportunity. Yet the fear that might have frozen another person only strengthened his resolve. He knew that stepping back now would undo everything he had worked for. To protect himself and his network, he implemented more advanced measures. He started using secure online channels, changing meeting locations frequently, and ensuring that all communication with journalists and supporters was encrypted. Even simple precautions like varying his daily routes or avoiding predictable routines became essential. It was no longer just about spreading the message, it was about survival, and the survival of those who had chosen to stand with him. One morning, as he reviewed documents and evidence, a wave of realization hit him. The story he had begun in a small town had now reached far beyond his expectations. Governments, organizations, and individuals from other regions were taking notice. Invitations arrived for interviews, panel discussions, and collaborations with advocacy groups. While he had never sought attention, he understood that this exposure could be a powerful tool for change. The world was listening, and he could use that to amplify the truth even further. Yet, amidst growing recognition, he remained humble. He constantly reminded himself and his supporters that the focus was not on him, but on the issues at hand. He spoke about the families affected, the communities at risk, and the responsibility people have to hold those in power accountable. Fame or recognition was never the goal. The goal was justice, transparency, and hope. The movement continued to evolve. People in other towns and cities began mirroring his efforts, documenting local issues and reaching out to the media. Ordinary citizens were becoming watchdogs, empowered by the example of one man who refused to be silenced. His story had ignited a chain reaction, proving that courage and persistence could ripple across borders, inspiring change far beyond the original setting. Despite the successes, the opposition became increasingly aggressive. They tried to manipulate legal systems, spread misinformation, and intimidate anyone associated with him. Threats became more personal, designed to create fear and discourage collaboration. But by now he had built a resilient network. People trusted one another, shared resources, and supported each other in ways that made it difficult for opponents to isolate him. The strength of community, he realized, was a shield no single threat could break. At the same time, he began reflecting on the human aspect of the struggle. It was not just about policies or regulations. It was about people's lives, their dignity, and their right to be heard. He visited families affected by negligence, spoke with workers whose safety had been compromised, and met with children who had been impacted by environmental harm. Each encounter reinforced his sense of purpose. He was not fighting for recognition. He was fighting for real lives and real justice. One evening, he held a small informal gathering with his closest supporters. They shared stories, reviewed evidence, and discussed strategies for the next steps. Despite the tension outside, the room was filled with determination and hope. They laughed at small jokes, shared moments of relief, and reminded each other why they had started this journey. Even in the face of fear, they found strength in solidarity. As part 3 of his journey unfolded, it became clear that his voice could not be silenced. The attempts to intimidate, manipulate, and erase him only made the movement stronger. Ordinary people were no longer passive observers. They were active participants, empowered to speak out and demand accountability. The quiet man from a small town had become a symbol of courage, persistence, and the transformative power of truth. And yet, even as the world began to listen, he knew that the challenges ahead would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. The opposition had not been defeated. It was adapting, searching for new ways to undermine the movement. But he was ready. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear. It was persistence, preparation, and unwavering commitment to what was right. The journey was far from over. But one thing was certain: the voice that others tried to silence had already reached millions. And each day more people were joining, speaking, and standing for truth. One man's refusal to stay quiet had created a spark. And that spark was now spreading like wildfire, reaching hearts and minds far beyond the small town where it all began. The days that followed were filled with both hope and tension. His message had reached far beyond the small town, and people everywhere were paying attention. Stories about his courage were shared online, printed in newspapers, and broadcast on local television. He received messages from people he had never met, thanking him for speaking the truth and giving them hope that they too could make a difference. Every note of support, every shared story strengthened him, reminding him that the risk he was taking mattered. Yet with this growing visibility came new dangers. The opposition, now realizing that they could not simply dismiss him, started taking more extreme measures. Anonymous calls became more frequent, and there were occasions when unfamiliar people were spotted near his home or following him to meetings. Once someone tried to break into the office where he stored his evidence, though thankfully nothing crucial was taken. It was clear the people who wanted him silenced were growing desperate.